Chris, could you just move to the antitrust policy notice and I'll take it from there. So the next slide would be great. All right. So everyone, this meeting is under the Linux Foundation antitrust policy, just like all of our other meetings. And if you want to read the full policy, you can do so on the Linux Foundation website. Now, if you are from a Linux Foundation member company, you can ask any questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. And that's it for antitrust. So next slide, if possible, Chris, and I'll explain what we're up to. This meeting basically always takes the same format. We do some news, we do work on standards and core material. That's the center of this meeting. We look at the reference and supporting material and do some work there if there's time. And then we have a space for any other business, and then we close the meeting. Let's dive right into the news, if that's okay. And we have some bits. First part of news, first slide of the news, if possible, is the elections. And we've completed the elections for specification and education. In this month, in February, we're doing an election with the telco work group starting today. There'll be nominations between today and the 26th of February, and then voting between the 27th of February and the 4th of March. The idea of all of these elections is to give a space for the various project work groups to renew themselves, for people who've completed their terms of office to step down if they wish, or to stand for re-election. Gradually, all of the OpenChain work groups and local groups will have elections, and that is part of our plan for making sure this is a sustainable project. If you're on the telco mailing list, keep your eye out for the nominations, which will start, as I said, today. And please do take part in the election. It just helps with our processes to make sure that we have a nice long-term approach to managing things. Let's have a look at the second piece of news. Okay, so I've started this new thing where I tell people what are the international meetings each week. And this week, we are looking at a series of meetings, Tuesday to Thursday. This is the first meeting, the America-Asia call. There will be another meeting scheduled today. It's going to happen at 1600 UTC. That's suitable for North America and Europe. It's the middle of the night here in Asia. I won't be on that meeting, but the co-chairs of the AI study group will be there. And we expect that to be Dave Marr from Qualcomm and Matthew Crawford from ARM. AI is our newest topic, and there's been a lot of interesting discussion around it. I'll talk more about it in a minute. We have two webinars this week. Wednesday, a webinar about license management. This is a tooling webinar about integrating a project into data in Open Embedded. So it's a pretty technical webinar. On Thursday, we have a webinar about software bill of materials, SPDX 3.1. This is a major update, and this is a major webinar describing the current status of what's going on there. The services profile especially, which includes things like export control. If you're sharp-eyed, you'll have noticed that the webinar on Wednesday and the webinar on Thursday have very different numbers. Why does Wednesday say 71? And why is the Thursday webinar the 60th? The answer is that the Wednesday webinar was added to our school much more recently at the request of our automation work group. And we actually have a bunch of webinars stacked up in the next couple of months. Webinar numbering will normalize throughout March and April. But all you really need to know is that our schedule of webinars is busy. Our automation work group will also meet this Wednesday. It'll be the European afternoon meeting, so that's suitable for Europe and North America. And on Thursday, we're expecting the education work group to get together. Education's in a transition point. We'll cover what they're up to in another slide. But basically, Nathan Kumagai has been tying off some major work before the handover to Andrew Katz from April onwards as the incoming chair. Let's go to the next slide and have a look at what's going on in AI. So I mentioned the AI study group is happening at the moment. So the AI study group is, first of all, discussing what is the problem, the challenge in AI compliance, and how can we address it. The last meeting was very important. It focused on scope. It took place on the 6th of February. That meeting is recorded, and you'll find it online there. The next meeting will happen, well, today, the 20th of February. It's on the schedule and that will be suitable for North America and Europe. I noticed that the link to the mailing list is having an encoding error, so I'm just going to put in the chat the same material with the links in case people want to join the AI mailing list. Now, for AI, the work group has moved really, really fast with discussion and scoping. So I think that this meeting that's scheduled for today will probably be assessing progress so far and then making a decision about what's next. Just in case you're new to what is happening in our project, a study group is trying to consider a challenge, define a challenge. When a study group has defined a challenge, it moves on to proposing itself as a work group to work on the challenge. So I think the AI study group is getting closer and closer to saying we've defined the problem. And that's really good progress. They've only been operating a month or so. Let's see what they've got. That meeting should be fun. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is something that I think caught my attention quite strongly. A French court just gave a grant of 650, well, a grant, gave an award of 650,000 euro damages for a GPL violation. It just happened on Valentine's Day, which I guess made the person litigating quite happy. It was definitely their gift of the day. And it is significant. It's one of the larger awards we've seen in recent times for a GPL violation. We're really lucky. Heather Meeker, one of the best lawyers in open source, well, I guess generally one of the best lawyers in the world, has written up on it. The link is in the chat as well as our slides. And it's a good example of the reason we have ISO 5230 to prevent the type of situation occurring in the first place so that something like this would never happen. Yeah, that's an interesting and significant development. Okay, so we're going to talk about the education work group and the cool stuff they've done and will be doing next, but that's not part of the news item because after we work on the standards, there's a specific section of this call for the education material. So I suggest we have a look at working on the standards and I hand over to Chris here. Is that okay with you, Chris?
Yes, give me coaching when I get a little stuck.
Of course, count me in. I'm ready on standby.
Okay, don't hesitate.
Yep.
Okay, so work on standards and core materials. So we'll jump right into the standards. So we have two open issues that we're going to work tonight on both of these specs and on the security and on the licensing specs. I'm sure you've all got your browsers open in GitHub and you're looking at those in person, right? Does
Yep.
any,
So these are the issue overviews, and then I think on the next two slides we'll have the specific direct link to the issues that we're going to look at or can look at. I'll also put them in the chat if that's okay. This
yes,
is the two licensing issues in the chat, and then the two security issues. What do you think? Shall we start with the licensing and see what we've got?
okay, now let me do this, stop that share, and then start a new one and we will share.
And if there's any issue with sharing, I can also share my screen, so just let me know.
Well, let's see what happens. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep, got it right here. So we need to,
Is it my messy screen or just the spec?
it's just showing the spec at the moment. And we need to go down to the 3.0 spec for the draft spec.
2.0.
Yeah, should be further down, I think. Oh, sorry. Yeah, 3.0.
Is it 2.0 or 2.1?
3.0 for the draft future version. Yeah. Okay. There we go. That's the draft for the
Okay.
future. All right.
So in this, we want to look at the content of 2.2 effectively resourced. And so we'll hop down to section 2. And there is 2.2 right here on the screen. So it says a set of open source software licenses identified as a result of following an appropriate method for identifying open source components from which the supplied software is comprised. So is the originator of the 2.2 effectively resourced comment with us tonight?
Let me have a look at what we've got. This is strange. The numbering I'm seeing here on our spec is not perfectly matching the numbering I see from Marcel on 2.2. I'm just going to also share my screen if that's okay, just
Yep.
to show the exact document. This is the comment that I see from Marcel. Um, and it seems that his comment is using an older numbering, which may have been an earlier draft,
Right.
where effectively resourced seems to be, what would you say? Seems to be uh, maybe now it's on the new draft 3.2 or something. Let me pull up let me pull up the spec as well. Uh, yeah, I just need a second to get there. Where's the spec 3? Okay. So Marcel was talking about effectively resourced 2.2 verification materials. I'm just double checking. License obligations 1.5, 1.5 scope, terms and definitions. His numbering doesn't match what I see here. Let me go down to 2.2 and see what's there. I'm on the actual document. Relevant tasks defined and supported. Okay. 2.2 effective resourced appears to be 3.2 relevant tasks defined and supported. And he's suggesting the fifth bullet of 3.2 and 2.2.5.
Which is down here. Yeah.
So he seems to be suggesting that he said the fifth bullet of 3.2. There is no fifth bullet of that. And 2.2.5 is 2.5 here. Okay, the only way I can read it is he's saying the process exists for resolution of open source compliance issues and a documented procedure um, is there for the handling and remediation of it. So that's the what you must do, a process, and a documented procedure to do the process. He's suggesting that those two are combined with license obligations. And he says license obligations is 1.5. Let me go up to, that would be 2.5. Program participants. That's not there anymore.
No, I
You
think it
know,
was earlier
yeah,
version.
right. It seems to be like the spec has changed a lot there, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. And he's ultimately suggesting that we combine, yeah, different parts of it. I think his comments are out of date. So I think we need to maybe just flag it as out of date and needs to be compared against the current draft. Because I just don't see how to reconcile this. Do you? I think we can't.
No, I
We need to,
agree.
yeah. Okay. I'm sorry for that confusion. Is it okay if I just say that this is too far from the current draft and needs to be reconciled and reopened? If he wants. Like, it just seems like it's a much earlier draft. I don't know. And does anyone else on the call have any opinions about that?
Yeah, the date looks like it's from 2020, so quite a while
Yeah.
ago.
Chris, if you've no objection, I'll just mark it and let Marcel know that this issue is not reading against the current draft. So if he still thinks it's valid, he should resubmit it. What do you think?
Yes, with the current, following the current numbering scheme of this version of the spec.
Yeah. So I'm just going to make a note of review on this date. I always use the ISO format for our dates. Okay. I'll just tag Marcel here. I see Prasad has joined. Hi, Prasad. I hope you're well. It's been a while.
Hi, good morning. Sorry, I was trying to get on the other invites. I think I had mixed up
Oh, the
a
old one.
couple of old links. Yeah. So finally managed to get here, but I have already gone through the deck. So appreciate you sending that. So I'll follow up.
Oh, my pleasure. And Prasad, I know you're deep involved with the SPDX work. So the SPDX webinar later this week is maybe a
Yep.
highly useful as we go through the 3.1 services profile, things like how it can include export control and the changes. We'll have Gary O'Neill doing a full depth review for us. That's on Thursday.
That's right. Yes, that'll be Wednesday evening, our time. I think both Gary and myself, we are the West Coast, but I'm not sure where Gary will be. But yeah, looking forward to that. We have quite a
Absolutely.
few, latest updates there. I met with Gary, Nisha, and a few others from the SPDX just a couple of weeks ago, and we just finalized on some of the both the infra and the data governance items as well. So I think Gary is going to go over that, and I think he already sent or at least shared the slides. Just FYI.
Yep, this is, and I'll be promoting this webinar pretty heavily because this work on SPDX I think is meaningful for our community, and they should be aware and involved early. Oh, SZ, I see SZ's hand is up. Over to you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, no problem.
Yep, this is SD. Yeah, since we might not able to respond the issue in time, so I'm thinking how to prevent this issue in the future. I can
Yes.
think I can think that maybe we need to add the version of the specification in the GitHub issue, or we can paste the snapshot of the content to make sure everyone is on the same page. Otherwise, we are, in the confusion state.
Yes. Yeah, SC, it's a really good point. I mean, when Marcel submitted this issue in 2020, we had locked down the ISO version of the standard. So we had locked down 2.2. It was somewhere in the middle of the ISO vote because the standard was published by ISO in December. So around July, when he submitted the issue, it had already been locked down, handed over to ISO in their process. So after that, the focus wasn't on editing the standard for quite a while. And we restarted our editing cycle about a year and a half ago, and we're going through the backlog of issues. But unfortunately, this one, by the time we got to it, was way out of sync with where we are in the proposed draft update. So the version numbering is different, the content is different. The only thing I can think of is that instead of having like a 2.5 year period where we captured issues but weren't editing, maybe we just need to have continuous editing with a goal of closing open issues. Which, Chris, that kind of dovetails into what you mentioned on the last call. Instead of soliciting a bunch of new issues on top of existing ones, if I recall correctly, you want to close the open issues as soon as possible.
I think that that's the best idea, so we don't trap old issues behind the new issues and then swap versions, and all of a sudden they're like this. This was extremely difficult to figure out exactly
Yeah.
where the comments were coming from. I guess I was going back through and looking at each earlier issue version.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really struggled, and that's on us, I guess.
Yeah.
This was just too long.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think, Chris? Shall we move to the second
I
issue
think,
for? Yeah.
yeah, I think so.
Do you want to screen share it, or do you want me to do it? Both are good.
Why don't you go ahead and do it, because I have lost my, oh, there it is.
That's cool. Yeah. All right. So this is also an old one, so let's see if it's still valid or not. This is another Marcel one. And by the way, Marcel has opened a bunch of issues because he is great. He focused a lot of these things. Okay. So Marcel in this issue is talking about improving the program foundation part of the spec. Now he listed it as 1.0 program foundation. We'll check the numbering. We'll make sure that we're still there. And he was suggesting that the program foundation is resorted. So this sounds like he thinks that the order in which we discuss something should be reordered, and some of the stuff should potentially be moved into different subsections. And it seems like the general point he has here is the workflow. So this isn't about changing the content of this per se. It's more about when you're reading the spec, you're reading the workflow in the type of sequence you would use for implementation. So, okay, let's take a look at what he's got. Program Foundation. Let's go find Program Foundation. Here we are. Program Foundation. So he was looking at that as numbered 1.0 in the current spec, based off the current ISO standard. That's under 3. It's a 3.1. And it's saying policy, competence, awareness. Then it goes to program scope, license obligations. So it's got, and I'm just gonna put these into the chat. So policy, competence, awareness, program scope, and license obligations. And I'm just going to copy this. So that's what we have in the current one. I put it in the chat. So program foundation subcategories currently. And I'm just going to put that over here. So I'm just putting this over here so we have a way to look at this together. Okay, so he's suggesting to change this around, to have this order changed and maybe move some stuff elsewhere. So the order change he's looking at is to move program scope to number 1, then policy, then awareness. He's actually thinking of moving competence into the next section, effectively resourced. And license obligations, he says. Oh, my apologies. He's thinking moving 1.2 competence at that time, 1.2 to just before effectively resourced. Let me just check where that is.
So would that be 3.1.2?
Point and is effectively resourced. Relevant tab. 3.2.2. So he's suggesting to move it from just between these two, between access and effectively resourced. He's suggesting that we move, I'm just going to double check what he suggested we move. Competence. So he's thinking access, then competence, then effectively resourced. So he's just like not changing it, just reordering it. And he's suggesting that license obligations, we move to chapter 2. There is no chapter 2. What was he saying? Chapter 2. Oh, task level. So that seems to be task level review and approval, I guess. That would be, I'm just double checking. License obligations. So he'd be putting license obligations around bill of materials, license compliance, moving it down there. Huh.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem crazy, right? It does seem to read better.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Well, now that I know that all of his numbers are preceded by a different number, it makes it easier to follow. I was really scratching my head.
Yeah, the numbering is different. And I think he skipped some numbers as well. You know, he skipped some numbers. Yeah, that wasn't easy. Because program scope was never a 1.1 per se. It must have been like 2.1.1 or yeah, because it's 3.1.1. Okay. So what he's suggesting then is that we move these into two different places. And I'm just going to paste where he'd say we move them, okay? So we'll see the, and bear with me, this will take a moment. Okay, so the first part is under Program Foundation, we would then have with him program scope. So these three have numbers. I'm going to put them in here with numbers. So that's 3.1. Okay, so I'm just going to add the numbers and then I'm going to move them around. And everyone, as you can tell, this is a pretty manual editing process, but you know, that's life. At least we're not doing this in assembly language.
Yeah.
Yep. Those were the days. Okay, so he's going to suggest that we start really moving this stuff around. Program scope, policy, and awareness. So program scope, policy, and awareness. And he's suggesting we finish that section here. And competence would go effectively resourced, just before effectively resourced. Okay, so effectively resourced is down here. That's 2. Competence. Have access. And we have effectively resourced. And below that we have, oh, that's right. So he's suggesting that where we have relevant tasks defined and supported, we actually grab this piece, put it in here, and change from 2 items in this section to 3 items, which, you know, it wouldn't change the spec, it would just change where some stuff is. And then he's suggesting license obligations. Which goes to the next section. Okay. The next section would be open source content review and approval. And that currently has bill of materials. Apologies for the high-speed copy and paste. This isn't intended to be super readable. I'm just grabbing the structure so we'll have the flow in the issue. Oh, it's only 2 items. Okay, so he's suggesting then in this area with 2 items, we take that item from the beginning, 3.1.5, we put it in here, and that might be a better workflow. Let's have a look at the workflow. So then the workflow would just be program scope, policy awareness, then move on to access, competence, resources, then move on to bill of material, license obligations, and compliance. That workflow looks sensible. I don't know. What do you think?
What is the title 3.3? Open source content review and approval. Yeah, makes sense.
And again, everyone, this is not proposing we change any terms. It's just proposing we change the order. And that would be splitting some stuff out of Program Foundation into what he identified as more operational items, defining your tasks and content and approval. So I guess the big question is then, scroll down, try to make this bigger. Do we want to regard the Program Foundation as an untouchable tenant of this standard, something that should stand on its own, and then the rest of the standard builds out about it, around it? Or do we want to say that the Program Foundation should be the general brushstroke of the of the program, but items in there, such as competence or license obligations, belong in the other sections that flesh it out. So is there a reason for us to keep competence and license obligations in Program Foundation? Do we need to keep them right there in the spec? Or can we put them into the more granular sections? Which leads to a second question. Is anyone partially implementing the ISO standard and then forgetting about it? Or can we just regard it that they're either going to adopt it or not? In which case it doesn't matter so much where we put them as long as the read is logical. What do you think?
Well, maybe to stimulate conversation a little bit, I think that competence and licensing obligations could go down in the task part of the spec and not up there in the program foundation area. I think we start breaking between the foundation and all the parts and pieces that it goes into making that foundation work.
This is this years since we built this. Gosh, it's 8 years.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a while. So I mean, this is normative, okay, my statement. If I recall correctly, I believe that in the very beginning, we were worried about the entire concept of defining a program. So a bunch of the core was put first to create the context and explanation of rationale. Like, this is compliance. Here it is. Start here. Expecting people to onboard from zero. Maybe we're a little bit further down the line now, where we can focus on making logical read-through in a more modular manner, because we're not starting from nothing formal in compliance exists. We're starting with 4 years of ISO standard, 8 years of de facto standard, and a large community. Maybe splitting it up into a more logical structure is sensible at this point in evolution. Does anyone have a contrarian view on this and feel like if we split this up, we might be doing something bad? Because obviously we don't want that. And to help provoke that conversation, I'm going to have a look at license obligations and license compliance. I'm just going to copy the text. So license compliance is here. License obligations is going to be up here. I'm just going to see what the read would be like with these sections. Okay, so if we did this, you'd have license obligations. A process shall exist for reviewing identified licenses, and then license compliance. The program will be capable of managing license use cases. So this is process shall exist for understanding the licensing and then dealing with it. Prasad, your hand is up. Over to you, my friend.
Hey, thanks, Shane. I think based on, at least in my humble opinion, I think the compliance and obligations, I think, yeah, keeping it separate definitely makes sense. Depends on, I can tell you certainly in organizations like large organizations like ours, especially where you have releases that are even, for example, like EOL, the obligations from license perspective will extend beyond EOL and even EOS. By EOS, I mean end of support or end of sale, whichever comes later. Whereas when you look at license compliance, that becomes more of an immediate criteria, or you can think of that as something like some sort of an exit criteria that needs to be baked into the product development life cycle of that organization. So in other words, the license compliance is more of a pre-ship criteria. Well, you think about license obligations, it just not only applies to things that you do prior to ship, but will extend beyond after ship and even in post EOL and EOS. So definitely having that, I think, two separate sections makes sense, because as things progress, I think, each of these will have its own set of aspects to talk about, and certainly more content to share.
Mhm. And with that in mind, do you think that the license obligations can fit under this subcategory, open source content review and approval, or it should be pushed up further in the stack, like into the program foundation? So, can it exist as a request under open source content review and approval, as a subcategory license obligations, another subcategory license compliance, or should it potentially be
I,
in a different
yeah,
section?
I think it should be probably in the more fundamental,
Okay.
because this is definitely becoming, I would say, a larger uh, item, at least at the organization level, that we need to be aware of and certainly bring awareness to. So I think this is definitely might be worthwhile to have that right along the policies and
Right.
awareness. I think this comes in there. I think that would be really helpful, especially for more than even the compliance senior leadership. It's more about the engineering and the product leadership bringing awareness. I think, yeah, definitely having that in the along with awareness makes sense, like right after that. Yeah.
So hypothetically, we would be looking at going here. So now we're looking at program scope, policy awareness, license obligations. So currently what we've done is we've reordered this, and we have one item under category for going into another section, competence. Now let's have a look at competence and see if it fits in here with access and effectively resourced, or it belongs more strategically. So I'll just pull it out. Access. Access. Competence. Resourced here. So I'm going to just move some stuff out of the way so we can look at this text as one block. Okay. So what we have here is the question of whether competence belongs in this section, relevant tasks, or it more properly belongs back up at the higher program foundation level. Which again, it's not a bad thing if it belongs up there. So the sequence then here is access, maintain a process to effectively respond to inquiries. So this is an operational item. Competence. Organization shall identify roles and responsibilities, determine the necessary competence of participants fulfilling each role, ensure the program participants are competent on the basis of appropriate education, take actions where necessary, retain documented information as necessary. And then effectively resourced, assign accountability, tasks are resourced, time to perform allocated, and so on. My reading is that access and effectively resourced in this section are very operational. Maybe competence is more strategic. I mean, maybe it does belong up higher. even though it reads like it should belong potentially in the same section, the way it's phrased seems to be modeling it as a strategic part before the operational. What do you think?
To me, competency is the ability to do the task.
Yeah.
So I think if you're going to have an effective program foundation, you've got to assume that the people are going to have the necessary competencies in order to do those things.
Right.
And I almost think that determining the necessary competencies of program participants fulfilling each role, that the next line is actually a sub-bullet of that and doesn't need to say, so it would be indented, because what that's doing is telling you how you determine what the competency is of the individuals based on appropriate education, training, and or experience.
Yep. Do you think we should keep this up at the program foundation area?
If if the organization doesn't have a foundational competency
Yeah,
within it, it's not going to be very useful.
that's true. Nothing's going to happen. Yeah. All right. So it sounds like two things maybe, Chris. One is if it doesn't have that, then other stuff like getting relevant tasks just won't work. So maybe competence has to stay up here at the foundation level, and maybe we just need to look at the formatting of competency to not today, maybe just the formatting of how competency is explained to make sure that the structure is as clear as possible.
Right.
Yeah.
And I also think that license obligations belongs down in the task part, because obligations are determined by a reading of the license and a concurrence from legal that that's the correct interpretation. So that's really part of doing the job. So it would come before compliance, because you've got to know what the obligations are in order to do the compliance. Say here are the compliance tasks that go with this
Right.
obligation. That's my thought. If anybody has any ideas based on what I just said, that's great.
So just to put that in context, Prasad, that to your point from earlier, that would suggest that for you, just going right back to the structure, Prasad, for you, license obligations were a higher level strategy item than license compliance. So it's not part of open source content review and approval. It's something you need to do before that.
No, that's not what I was saying. I
But
was saying that you determine what the obligations are as you're going through the open source content review and approval processes. And that's where you identify new obligations.
Right.
Right.
I think, I think it is interrelated. I think I agree with what you were just saying earlier. The language and terms of the licenses that you identify or associate with, that will determine to a certain extent obligations. But where I'm coming from is when I say license obligations for, in fact, product organizations, even from starting from awareness, planning, resourcing standpoint, this is something that needs to be well understood. Like this is regardless of, let's say, what is the level or extent to which the open source or licenses or open source components are being part of your offerings. Trying to kind of understand the broader um,
Right.
license obligations is something that is more fundamental, at least from leadership, planning, resourcing standpoint. And that's what I was trying to make sure, because in many cases where a product offering could be very well UOS'd, but still you are subjected to, you as an organization are subjected to certain legal license obligations, depending on the region where your product offerings are being shipped. And that extends well beyond the life cycle of the product. Also, that needs to be understood and essentially planned for and resourced for by the leadership.
Let's have a look at the text while we're doing that. I'm just going to pull up the text so we can see what exactly is on it. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I just wanted to pull the text up on the page so it's also just available. Yeah.
Yeah, I think here, at least kind of reading through this sentence, it does seem to me that, what it's trying to imply is, for the most part, license obligations are determined by um, the terms of what the specific licenses
Yeah.
that are being used or associated with the product offer. Um, that's what it states. I think this is definitely valid. At the same time, let's say there are certain cases where the underlying license usage,
Right.
regardless of what usage or what type of licenses that you use in your offering, you as an organization or you as a product owner are
Do
subjected
something.
to legal obligation in terms of providing, let's say, a publication when there is an external inquiry that happens, right? And that extends for a certain number of time or number of years, well past your EOL or EOS date. So that's something that is beyond the terms and conditions of what is really stated in the license, but it's more of a determined by the legal obligation at that point, where you are subjected to provide that license compliance artifacts, um, you know, even in the future.
And would this potentially go beyond the scope of what the license asks, but more generally some kind of regulation?
Exactly.
Example, Sarnes-Hawksby, or Sarnes-Oxby or something like that, where you have to maintain records for X amount of years.
That's,
Exactly.
Yeah.
but that's where you get those legal terms is out of each license. And each license may be different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where if an organization was to categorize all of their licenses as they come through so that they use the same set of obligations, the legal terms that are driving how you use that license and whether or not you can distribute it and what needs to go with it if you distribute it, for example, like the general public license, and for how long you have to do that. Those are all things you just mentioned a minute ago.
Yeah.
Is it possible that we are missing, not on the license obligations, which is pull out the terms from the license, but that we're missing some guidance at the policy level here, where we just say make a policy?
Mm-hmm.
That maybe it should also make a note that your policy should include, oh, where appropriate, reference to legislation. I think, Prasad, that's what you're getting at. Like outside licensing, there might be other stuff that impacts your licensing, right? So a legislation says you need to keep record keeping for X amount of years or whatever. That's beyond the licenses per se. Is that right?
exactly. Right, exactly. I think, yeah, attaching that at a higher level, like, with the
Like a policy
policy,
level.
right,
Yeah.
that gives you more, in my opinion, at least more awareness, at least at a much exact kind of senior leadership level, because the challenges, I think, as earlier, the gentleman who mentioned, I think it's absolutely right that many of these obligations are, to a certain extent, driven by the license language. um, you know, Very frankly, like, yeah, with the GPL, you have that distribution criteria that, you are obligated to distribute sources for X number of years. Um, but people may not really realize, like, until that usage really comes in and really sinks in at a later point. At that point, the organization or the leadership is not ready, and you may end up in a situation where they are not necessarily staffed or resourced. Those challenges do happen. So I think having that part of the policy more at a fundamental level is much more helpful, I think, for bringing early attention and trying to kind of as a policy, I think it'll be much more helpful and adoptable, and bring more awareness for the organization to be ready.
Hypothetically, we could add this as a low energy lift for us, which would just be maybe on the policy, have a couple of example bullet points of things to consider in your policy level. And meanwhile, move the practical licensing obligations, yeah, back down here. So know your license obligations, the practical side is down here, but on the policy level, there's something saying, a policy should include blah, 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 blah. Because right now we don't say anything about what the policy should be. We just say have a policy. And maybe we could add should or may or something similar. Do we need should? Maybe not. That might be prescriptive. May include, and then
Yeah, some
requirements.
sort of a recommendation, correct. Yeah, may include might be a better language. Yeah.
And that could be like, may include, of course, reference to the license requirements, may include reference to legislative requirements, and so on.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And potentially that means we could address this with just one sentence to give some brainstorm ideas about what a policy could be. But meanwhile, we move the practical nuts and bolts down here into, dig into your license obligations.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. Any objections to doing that?
No,
Oh, this
I
looks
think
good.
that's a good approach.
Yeah, agree.
Right. And that means we haven't added any terms or requirements. We've simply reordered stuff, plus added
Those external references, right? I think, yeah, to the legislation and
right.
other external references that are outside the realm of license compliance. I think that also bringing that reference is really helpful. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yep. Okay, so then I'm just doing the final reorder, and we're actually out of time. We've been so busy on this call. Okay, so then the final thing would be to reorder these 5 into moving competence down into relevant tasks, license obligations into open source content and review, and on policy, just include a note about reference to legislation and so on as examples, so people think through the big strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that's great. We managed to reorder things and clarify things without making any new obligations or changes to the ISO standard.
Yay!
A win! So, I mean, we're out of time. there's other stuff to do, but I guess it's stuff for the next call. There's 2 issues open on licensing. What I'll do is I'll just add a note that we're making this change, and I'll take the action item to implement the change in the draft. And we're good to go. We've closed 2 issues, and we're ready for the next round, which will be 2 security issues on the next call, North America, Europe in 2 weeks. And Chris will be doing that one solo. He's kindly offered to allow me to sleep at a whole night through.
Now, I may not be as quick as you on what you're doing right there.
Well, you know, it's what's the carpenter thing? Measure twice, cut once. Speed
Yep.
is not. All right, everyone, thank you so much. Chris, thank you for leading us on this. Prasad, great comments, and have a beautiful day, everyone.
You do the same. Have a good night's sleep.
Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you, Shane. Appreciate setting this up. Thank you.